Well, hello everybody, this is Tim Green with the Rattle Magazine, and welcome to your critique of the week. It's Friday, August 28th. Thanks so much for being here. Missed everybody last week. Last week I was on the road. We had a cabin up in California still. We closed that up, drove back in the old Subaru Outback. I thought I wouldn't make it in time for the critique of the week. Actually, it turned out I did, but the odds were good enough that I thought we should just cancel. And so we took the week off, sort of unloading the car too and stuff on Friday last week. But it's great to be back. It's always fun to do this. A great way to end the regular work week. Let's see who we have here. It's a Labor Day weekend too. Happy Labor Day, says Tom Barlow. Good to see you, Tom. Lynn Schilling is here. Hey, Lynn. Steve Horrell, Tom Barlow, I said already. D. Coleman, Mark Grinier's here. Jamal Udin. Winston Munn's here. Patty Arbor. Katie Dozier. The next room over. We got Nancy Sabanek here. Kimberly Gibson Tran, howdy to you too. PMB is here. Let's see, Mary Keating is here. Mary Lisa is here. Stephen Smith. If you can hear that rumbling, it actually looks like it's night. Like this is like the night setup, but it's a really full day in the Woodlands, Texas, but it is almost as dark as night with the storm rumbling in. If you hear that thunder in the background, maybe. Let's see, Sarah Rashid Khan is here. Sandra Fees, Hammett Malik. All the way down under. Chelsea McClellan is here. Good to see you, Chelsea. Jesse A. CLAS is here. Let's see. Danette Burmia. Yeah, looking good. So glad to see a good crowd on hand. Now we're going to look back at the oldest submission queue, try to get through as many as we can. I should also say before we start, the new poetry space drops. Has anybody checked that out yet? With Billy Collins. We finally got him on. Talking about poetic hospitality, or accessibility, also known as, but nobody likes that term. So we have a great episode with Billy. Just released the first half of it over on the Poetry Space with Katie. So check that out after the show. We're going to have Billy on here. We were waiting for his book to come out. He's got a new book coming out in November, Dog Show. So he'll be a regular Rattlecast guest then. But he's on the Poetry Space right now. Let's see. Yeah, Kimberly Gibson Tran, all overcast in Dallas. Yeah, getting a taste of the fall temps. It's still warm here, but we'll see. But the thunder definitely is rolling in. All right, so speaking of rolling in, let's roll into some poems. And as always, the goal is to give that workshop experience so valuable. Hearing what people feel, how they feel, what they think, what they relate to, what they can react to your poems. So we're going to go through, there's a special submission category for this. It's not just randomly pulled from submissions. If you want your submissions to be gone over, submit them. Go to rattle.com. Up on the top of the menu bar under content, find critique of the week. Submit your poems there. You can submit one or two. We'll give it a look at some point when we can. And you can have a lot of feedback. And we're always trying to be helpful, so leave as many comments as you can on your thoughts when we go over these poems. Okay, so the first poet is going to be Dennis Usden. Actually, if anybody, how's the sound quality? If anybody let me know. I had a screen right here with a blanket hanging on it for extra absorption. But we also have some sound panels and stuff. So we thought we'd maybe take it out. The office here, which you can't see, looks a lot nicer without a big screen there. But there might be less sound absorption. So if you hear any echoes, let me know. I won't be able to hear until I listen back later. Anyway, let's take a look at the first poem. And Dennis Usden, who is here sometimes, is the poet. Yeah. Okay, sounds so good. Okay, good. All right, so Dennis Usden, the poet, no questions. His poem is The Real. And let's take a look. The Real. Yeah, that's some thunder. See, up in California, we hardly ever got storms. So I'm just like mesmerized now after living there for 20 years. When every time we get some thunder and lightning, it's pretty neat. All right, here's Dennis Usden's poem, The Real. And first off, I should say, just if anybody's wondering about this, the poem is submitted, you see, in 2 columns. This is one poem. Don't bother doing this when you do submissions. It just makes it a little harder to read as you're reading through as an editor. And it's not going to be formatted like this in the issue of the magazine, of course. There's really no reason to put it on 2 columns to fit on one page. It just doesn't matter. So don't make columns on your documents. They're just kind of annoying, especially when you're doing a broadcast like this, because then you're going to have to scroll and move around weird to get both sides of the poem in. That's no big deal. Just don't bother. Let's read the poem. The Real. We gathered at our favorite restaurant in Boca Raton and sat down on a narrow table. A pizza box carried by a waiter tipped the top of a goblet like dominoes. All the crystal fell, the shards of glass twinkled like snowflakes. As they descended in the fluorescent light to the porcelain floor, The light fixtures started blinking in unison, faltering, gasping, then darkness swallowed the building. Thunder rattled the ceiling like pounding fists. Oh, that's kind of cool. People slid under their tables. Others ran to exits they could not see. Some fell and limped to get away like marionettes with their strings cut. Soon the sirens blasted their uneven tones like a mechanical cry to the city. A chorus of cell phones announced emergency messages without explanation. This felt like a nightmare, and it was. Then my clock radio beeped to wake me. Breaking news. Oh, wait, I already read this poem. Did we ever read this poem, or is this a different version? Anyway, then my radio clock beeped to wake me. Breaking news reported on CNN. Yeah, I think this is another version, a slightly different version of the poem we read a couple weeks ago by Dennis. All the judges of the United States court system had been fired en masse. The Constitution permitted Trump to do so. A line in that document had been found, which had been missing since our founding, unearthed by the Musk team. It was fantastic and beautiful. I tried to go back to sleep, but was afraid of this real nightmare. Yeah, we've already read it. I think this is a slightly different version because I saw the other poem there. And I will say, I think maybe in this new version, we already pointed out the turn to the political was sort of disappointing. And and one thing it might be a new addition to this version, but I'll just say it really quick. The, where was it? People sitting at the table. Oh yeah, some fell and limped to get away like marionettes with their strings cut. Now, first of all, like marionettes with their strings cut is a cliche, but also, if you're going to use something, it should be accurate. And this is like marionettes with their strings cut don't limp away. They don't move. They fall into a flop of dead weight, And so that doesn't really make sense for that description either, in addition to the cliche, which is interesting, though, in how it illuminates the way cliche works, because it's a image, it's a metaphor that has already gone so far that it replaces the original image. So we think, marionettes with their strings cut. Originally, that's a really cool concept, but it's really vivid. It's a vivid way to think about things. But we've heard it so much, we don't actually even think about it. So this was written out without even thinking about the fact that it doesn't make sense in this context. So it's interesting to see that. But yeah, the turn to the political I think we had a whole discussion about that aspect, so we won't. Oh, PMB says like marionettes with one string cut. And that's a great example of a way to make something cliche new, make it new again. And if you've all heard that expression, like marionettes with their strings cut. But if it was one string cut, that changes it enough where it's a new, vivid image. So that's a cool idea. Yeah. Kimberly Gibson Tran says the turn is still disappointing. In this version too, wish the power of the storm disaster was allowed to stand on its own, apart from the overt reference to politics, or don't name the political forces. Yeah, that's one of those things. If you're going to write a poem in this vein, where the symbolism is representing the political, a great thing to do would be to title it something with that, and then have nothing else in the poem be that, and then it'll be less disappointing. And actually, it's one of the things mentioning that Billy Collins episode. He read one of his poems, Hell. And one of the things is that having that touchstone hell, you could always refer back and knew what you were talking about, even as it was going into the extended metaphor. And that's the kind of thing where you can get away with doing more sort of political maneuvering and having that symbolism speak more if you don't mention it, but then have the reference be the title. So that's a way to do a political poem in this direction. Anyway, let's move on. This is very similar to the version we read a few weeks ago. Let's move on to the next poem. But thanks for sharing that, Dennis. Next up we have Larry Cavaney, who's been on here before. Yeah. So this is I'm not even going to go with this one. We're just going to move along because we've talked about Larry's poems, and this is similar to other poems Larry submitted. So let's move on. And let's go to, instead, Gabriel Inglis from British Columbia. And let me see if Gabriel has any questions. No general questions. 2 poems. Let's take a look. We have a short one and a sort of average size one. Let's take a look at the short one first. Here we go. You thought you discovered me, but I was a coelacanth. I'm saying that, coelacanth. I think that's one of those really, really ancient fish, I believe. Right? Like one of the oldest, sort of a living fossil, it's always referred to. But let me make sure I'm remembering that word right. We could show a picture of it too. Yeah, a lobe-finned fish. Here, let's take a look at the living fossil, the coelacanth right there. So that's what we're talking about. Here's the poem. You thought you discovered me, but I was a coelacanth. You thought I was extinct to the now world, but I was living a fluttering secret, nourishing those who knew, as I knew which ocean's maelstrom gave me time. So did you discover me in some vivid market hive, surrounded by florid auras, busy lives? Where I had never been forgotten. All right. Yeah, you thought you discovered me, but I was a coelacanth. Yeah. It is a celacanth. Thank you. And I'm sure Dryamontiodo knows. That's a strange pronunciation for that word. That's why I was thinking it was wrong, because I thought it was that, but it's spelled so different. Celacanth. Thank you very much. Okay, let's read it again. You thought you discovered me, but I was a celacanth. There you go. You thought I was extinct to the now world, but I was living a fluttering secret, nourishing those who knew, as I knew, which ocean's maelstrom gave me time. Did you discover me in some vivid market hive, surrounded by florid auras and busy lives, where I had never been forgotten? Yeah. Burmese says I like the phrase florid auras, or auras. Yeah. Kimberly Gibson Trent says fluttering secret is nice. There's some nice lines here, and a nice, we're speaking in personification about, from the perspective of the celacanth. And it feels like an interesting start to a poem, but it doesn't really go very far. Yeah, exactly. Jesse A says, I feel like the poem could go somewhere more. It's a decent setup. Yeah, Kimberly Gibson Trent says, doesn't feel finished. I want to push on. And exactly that. How does that... So you feel a sense that there's some kind of... this is speaking for the poet's sort of inner life in some place. Yeah, Holly says, I'm not following the metaphor. Lynn Schilling says, but why should we care? But I like... Yeah, as Nancy Sabanek says, I agree. I like the lines we read so far. So it's a good start. Kimberly says, I need more than with the IU relationship. Yeah. And Sarah Rashid Khan says, I'm not much of a fan of questions unless it leads to something I would never think of. Yeah. And so this really just feels like a start to the poem. You thought I was extinct to the new world. So go on and make something. We read, speaking again about the poetry space, there was a poem that we happened to read a couple weeks ago when we talked about the New Yorker. So that was some close thunder. It was it was a giraffe. Can I pull it up fast enough? And who wrote it? Ariel, Jericho Brown. That's right. So see how this is a good example of what you can do with this kind of personification. We'll pop this in. Oh no. Okay. We'll put this in here. Hopefully they'll let us read it. This is Aerial View by Jericho Brown. And I don't know if we'll read the whole thing or maybe some, but Aerial View. People who romanticize an Africa they've never seen like to identify themselves with lions. It's all roar and hunt, quick fucks and blonde manes. People love the word pride. Haven't you seen the parades? Everybody adores a lion but me. I want to be a giraffe. I'm already tall and long-necked. In the real Sahara, a giraffe beats a lion's ass every day on Instagram. I've seen a giraffe shake the leaping cat off its back and toss it like litter. I've seen a giraffe stomp hooves down hard on the lion's face before it got the chance to meow. I want to be a giraffe and eat greens of every variety straight out of the tree. I already like to get high. Lions need animals like us. We need no prey. I already won't chase anybody for my food. But maybe I can still be romantic in spite of my pride. Someone will notice up the sky, not down the street. You can watch me while I watch you and the rest of the savannah from my aerial view. Lord, let me get higher. Just one of me is a parade. And so see how it takes that idea. We're speaking in personification of myself through the view of the giraffe. And feel how that's how the poem goes farther. It pushes into that concept. And this exact kind of thing that the Celacanth poem wants to do. We want to push this poem farther and see where you can go with it. What would it actually be like to be the Celacanth, and how does that relate to your life? Like, that's the interesting thing about this concept as a poem. There's some good lines in there. Like, push and keep playing with that. Like, have fun. Yeah. So, as Winston Munn says, it's the start of a walk, but we didn't get very far. Yeah. And Winston Munn says, who is the you? Yeah. So... yeah, so it's a great start to a poem, but it hasn't explored its subject matter yet, and I think, wow, it's really coming down out there. Anyway, let's move on to the next poem because there's not much more to say about it than that. It's just a start to a poem, and an interesting start though. Let's take a look at the next one up, and it's a little longer, so maybe it'll be a little fuller. This is "Ode to a Broken Cuckoo Clock." So good setup already with the title. We know that it's an ode. We know what it's to or for. We could, it's a slightly different thing if it's to or for. And then there's a broken cuckoo clock. So there's always something to go back to as we look at this. So let's take a look. The broken cuckoo clock on the wall has braided chains draped down for minutes, hours, and days to climb, but they won't. They'll hang there, pinwheeling for all time. It lived in my mother's house for years. She says she likes her cuckoo clocks to sing at all hours and to click off all the seconds between. So she knows when she is awake, and she knows that she's alive, and when it stopped, she passed it on to me. As for me, I want my clock silent, wall-mounted odes to bird princesses, trapped in towers, calling out the time to pass, to set them free, to let them live. I know there is a tiny life inside. I know I could release and it would sing again, but I also know when I am awake without a Rapunzel bird reminding me. Yeah. And so this sort of does what the other poem needed to do, because it turns, as Kimberly Gibson Tran, I think it was, says, I like the entrance of the mother and the turn to the personal. And that's sort of what the first poem wanted to do. Is we take that Celacanth and make it about something about our lives, the speaker's life, and then our lives, how it relates to that generally too. And so I really like the first two stanzas personally. Like, it really set the stage well. It described the mother and that situation really well. The third stanza didn't feel like it had the same music or energy. It felt like it hadn't really, it lost the voice a little bit to me and didn't have the same, like it was sort of like swerved to get to the ending instead of taking its time to get there. Bernie says Rapunzel bird is a great phrase. Well, let's read it again. Look at more detail. Ode to a broken cuckoo clock. The broken cuckoo clock on the wall has braided chains draped down for minutes. I think I wouldn't repeat the phrase broken or just the description broken. We're already repeating a lot, and repeating the title in the first line is a way that it sucks some of the energy out of the poem, because you're waiting for some kind of surprise, something new, and then you get sort of the same information. So it's sort of it's just a meaningless bit. But if you take broken, it's okay if you take out broken. So I would just cut the broken. The cuckoo clock on the wall has braided chains draped down for minutes, hours, and days to climb, but they won't. They'll hang there, pinwheeling for all time. And I wonder too, so we introduce they, but they won't. And it's a little bit confusing because we haven't established who they are. I assume they is the cuckoos in the cuckoo clock, but we don't say that explicitly. And so it's a bit of a leap to insert that, and it throws you out of the poem slightly. And given that we're repeated cuckoo, and the broken cuckoo clock is all our repetition, cut cuckoo too, and the birds won't, and let it be like that. Introduce that. So establish who the they is. Then you don't want people like fishing around to make sense of meaning. You want people to take what's given and process that and make that emotional connection or paint the story out of it. And so if we're fishing around for any kind of who are you referring to, even if just for a second, then we realize, oh, you mean the birds in the cuckoo clock. Even that moment is something where it sucks some of the energy out of the poem, some of the connection. And it's a delay of that. It pulls our attention away from where our attention should be. So move the cuckoos there, I would say. Yeah. And then Dry Montino points this out too. Why do the chains pinwheel if they're broken? If pinwheel is a verb, I imagine it moving. Yeah, that was another question I had too. And so thanks for going to that, because we're talking about the ones when they work at first. And then we talk about after they stop working, then I take them as a display on my wall and as a speaker. And so it's that felt a little strange. I didn't understand that. Yeah. So anyway, hang on 1 second. Let me. Sorry about that. Okay. So, yeah. So PMB says, what does pinwheeling mean? Yeah, and that means spinning like a pinwheel. And I'm not sure, don't those chains like up and down? They kind of hang, and then there's like a wheel, and eventually they turn over, right? Anyway. He lived in my mother's house for years. She says she likes her cuckoo clocks to sing at all hours and to click off all the seconds between, so she knows when she is awake and she knows that she's alive. And when it stopped, she passed it on to me. And as somebody pointed out already, where was it? Tom Barlow says the second sentence starts in present tense but ends in past tense. There's the tense issue there. It lived in my mother's house for years. She says, and it should be she said. So we have a sense of like where we are in time is starting to get lost in this poem too. It lived there. She says she likes the cuckoo clocks to sing at all hours and to click off all the seconds. So she knows when she is awake and she knows when she is alive. And when it stopped, she passed on to me. So we're past tense, present tense for most of the poem, and then past tense for for the last two lines. And so that needs to be fixed. Let's see. Dry Montito says, I like the idea that some people only like a moving clock and some like to display a frozen clock. It's just two very different emotional attitudes toward time and memory. That's a great way to put it. That's the strength of the poem. Don Kasky says, does it imply she passed? And to me, it hasn't yet because the clock stopped and then she passed it on to me. Maybe it does, but it's not clear. As for me, I want my clock silent, wall-mounted odes to bird princesses trapped in towers, calling out to time, to pass, to set them free, to let them live. I know there's a tiny life inside. I know I could release. And it would sing again. But I also know when I am awake without a Rapunzel bird reminding me. So... I like the idea for the poem, but that needs to be fleshed out more. I think there's a lack of exploration of that section. Jenny Middleton says, I think the Rapunzel image is linked to the plated pendulums, but could more of this be made of this link to the fairy tale about someone being trapped, removed from their own time? Yeah. Diamantino says, no, literally read this says that the mother is still alive. The tense issue is tangled, but can be read as intentional. Yeah. Mark Grenier likes the Rapunzel bird image in the end. Yeah. So it's a really good setup for a poem. But some of the descriptions don't quite make sense. And then I want this, like, think about it, how you could move through the poem in time, especially given the fact that time is, that the tense is tricky in the poem. Like, we could have a scene where we're looking at the mom's clocks, and then, that's like a flashback to start the poem, and then we come to the present in a very clear way where we're actually looking at the clocks on our wall now. And that would make sort of the comparison of the way we both think of the clocks and time, as Jared said, that would put them up, there's a past looking at that, and there's a present, and then have that be very clear that we're looking at it from two different perspectives. And then, if you put yourself in the poem, and so you're seeing the flashback of your, the mom showing the clocks or them always being there in the house, and then looking them in the present on the wall, and then comparing the way in that way, both halves would be a lot more vivid and coherent. And I think that's the direction to take with this poem, because it's a really interesting concept and thing to think about. And so finding our sense of place and time within the poem and how we're like situated within that is the real key to unlocking this and making it really work, I think. Yeah. Mercury says this reads like a poem that hasn't quite identified the subject. And Kate LL says, many clocks, but she passed it on to me. Yeah. Okay. And Mary Lisa says she seems to be trying to distinguish herself as different from the mother, so maybe more examples or tell us why she likes the silence. That's another thing too. If there's more to it, if you want, I know, Jared's Diamantino, has less, enters into his poems less, and they're more, concepts, and that's a great way to write too. If you want to make it more personal and go to a deeper level, you can talk more about the relationship between the mother and extend the poem farther once you have that established. Yeah, Winston Munn says the ending is flat, and that's kind of why. So we haven't really fleshed out this, coherently what's going on an emotional level in the poem. So one of the things you can do is push deeper by having that, situated where we are in space and time within the poem. And then, think back on the mother. Think back on, experiences you've had. As you're looking at the clocks that are now not moving in your house, like, what does that remind you of in the way that your mother was as a person versus you? And like, what memories does that pull up? And maybe go to a third space. And maybe that's the way to go. So again, I think it feels like an incomplete poem. Not as incomplete as the last one, but still incomplete. So, yeah. Petty Arbor says, bird trapped inside time is what I want more of. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, let's move on to another poem. Another poet altogether. Once again, that was so interesting poems. So good lines in both by Gabriel Inglis from British Columbia. Let's go next to Arlene Kosakoff from Del Mar, California. No questions, just a short poem. Here we go. Unexpected vow. An unexpected vow. I didn't know how much I would love that dog. The vow I made to take care of him forever was not what I ever thought I would make, since my life was cruelly unstable, unhappy, and not conducive to taking care of anything, including myself. Yet in spite of internal and external chaos, that dog got walked, fed, cuddled, and loved every day for 15 years. When death claimed him, I lost all purpose to continue, but continue I do, an aimless face each day. There we go. And then the above is written by Arlene Kosakoff about my little mini poodle Elvis, whose image and spirit will always be alive. Um, yeah. Okay. Well, let's see. So for this one, even this is something that happens kind of fairly often within reading submissions. Written about my little mini poodle Elvis, whose image and spirit will always be alive. There's sort of more life in that little description, saying a mini poodle Elvis, than there is in the poem itself. Like, I didn't see the poodle. I didn't feel connected to it. I didn't really know, that dog. I didn't really know. I didn't get a sense of like who that dog was or what the dog even looked like until this little description at the end. So make your poem. This is something especially that happens. It's very common with poets writing from prison, because there'll be these amazing letters that you get that are really gripping, talking about their life story and how things went wrong and how they're trying to correct things and what happened and what it's like. And you're like, really, wow, these poems are going to be great. And then you open up the poems and they're so distanced that you don't really feel connected to them. And so if you want to write a poem for us about your little mini poodle Elvis, describe Elvis, use his name. What was it like? Make us see it. And then we can really connect it. We have to have some kind of, we have to have a sense of what we're connecting with in order to connect on that emotional level. And so this is sort of it's like a description, as somebody said, where did it go? A truly a personal poem, says Holly York. Yeah. It feels like something, Sarah Rashid Khan says, it feels like something you write in your diary. And it's like an explanation of the feelings instead of evoking the feelings themselves. And how you do that is by focusing on the specific details of the dog and the relationship and, letting us feel, Mark Doty is a great example of someone who has really wonderful dog poems. There's all those other examples too. If you bring that dog to life through your words, then we can connect and feel the loss and we can sort of share all that together. And that's Kimberly Gibson Trent says this poem has the show don't tell issue, and that's it. It's telling us how you feel, which is, we hear how you feel, but we don't feel it too unless you describe that and make it vivid using concrete images and making us connect and letting us feel what the experience is like. So describe that dog in detail. The details are the key to everything. As Bryn Pope says, personal poem to process loss. And and there's nothing wrong with writing a poem like this to help articulate your own emotions for yourself. It's just that we can't connect until we start to see the actual details of the situation. Yeah. Okay. And Danette Burmese says, I would love to hear how Elvis the dog was like or not like Elvis Presley. Yeah, and how did Elvis get the name? There's so much you can talk about that we would find interesting. It's the detail, it's the nuance, it's the specificity, it's the things that make that dog unique. And those are the things that you remember about the dog, I assume, and those are the things that we want to read about as readers. It doesn't matter what the topic is; those are the things that we connect and care about. All right, let's move on to another poem. Thanks for sharing that, though, Arlene. And next up, we have Hafsat Mokhtar from Nigeria, I believe, NG. Here's a quick poem, only one. Title is Duality. It's up in the title bar. Let's take a look. Duality. You are in every thread of thoughts in the tapestry of my soul. Why didn't time stop when clearly I'm a broken clock? Hey, there's a broken clock again. These lines that my heart writes every day and each night under the cruel stars that didn't align, I am a joke, and I hear them laugh. I sit and stare. They giggle and point at the girl with pieces she calls a heart. The sun also mocks me, with its shines and all. Why wouldn't she? I clearly have no shade, and the ground swallows me each time I wake, and I do not fault it, for you are not there to prevent me from sinking, and the waters drown me each and every day, and still you are nowhere. You are everywhere, yet nowhere. This duality will be the end of me. And so we have the concept of the duality is interesting in the where it goes at the end, and it's an interesting thought for a poem. But it suffers the same problem. Dry Montito says a broken clock is the right image twice a day. Yeah, Winston Munn, it's the same problem. And I don't even know which poem Winston's talking about here. He says, describing your feelings does not make the reader feel. Again, it's all about putting specific details, letting us be lost in the imaginative moment of the poem, whatever's happening, that memory coming to life. So we enter that like we're watching a movie or something. And then we get to feel the same thing that the speaker feels. And that's the power of poetry. But we need the details about it. We can't have abstractions. You know what the situation is you're writing about. Well, we don't. And we don't care unless you tell us. And so it's all those details. We were talking about the dog last time, but the she in this poem. What is she like? Like show us that in a way that's unique that we've never heard things described before. And then we'll really connect with it. But it has to be that way. We can't just hear, that the tapestry of my soul is like a broken clock. It just doesn't work. And the heart, telling us about how things are doesn't connect with us. We need details. We need to connect through that. And that's what sparks the imagination and lets us connect. Lynn Schilling says, who is you? Yeah. All right. Well, let's move on to the next poem. But thanks for sharing that once again. That was Hafsat Makhdar. Yeah, these are people ask. These are from back in March. This is Arnav Jain from India, sharing this poem "Dreams." Again, a very short poem. There's sort of a bio. Arnav is a passionate poet who finds inspiration in the beauty of everyday moments. I don't see any questions here, though. I think this might, yeah. And again, I think we're going to skip this poem too because it's the same kind of thing. There's. Some poems, if we write poems that are meant, that they feel kind of like journal entries, there's nothing wrong with that. But they have to have specific details. They have to tell the story, or at least set us into something that we can imagine, that we can enter, so we can feel what's going on and have the experience that the speaker experiences. If it's vague and general, it just doesn't work. And this is the same thing for this poem too, so we're just going to skip it without reading it. Next up, we're going to have Lauren Ortel from Austin, Texas, not too far down the road. 2 poems here in general questions. Hi, Tim. I'm curious if these poems are too narrative and the best way for me to address that through editing. I'm interested in your general feedback suggestions as well. Okay. So let's take a look at this from once again, Lauren Ortel. Here we go. Glory in this meeting of foot and leg. I've never been sure if I believe in God, but every once in a while, there's a moment that I feel so fully alive, connected to all things that have ever been and ever will be. I start to believe in something. Like when I pull a scrunched but soft pant leg down to cover my ankle again, and the sensation of my own touch, and the material that was woven with another's hands and this segment of skin being protected, newly cared for and warmed, feels divine. Same for when I'm overheated and I roll a pant ham up over my ankle, giving it a shock of fresh air that feels like I'm finally appreciating my sturdy legs that have forgotten me this far. Maybe I wouldn't have seen as many beautiful places if these 2 thick ankles had been slimmer. Maybe they would have been more prone to injury. With these brief gestures, I am forgiving my body and my ankles, which, like me, also need to breathe. I will let them, and it will be glorious. Well, the question of is it too narrative? I mean, narrative implies some kind of story arc, and I think it's sort of a monologue type poem, and I think that it's like addressing us directly about a topic, yeah. And so, yeah, exactly. So Kinley Gibbs and Trent says this is not what I think of as narrative-driven, more character-driven. Yeah, it's more of like a monologue. It's driven by the voice of the narrator, which is different generally than what we think of when we think about being narrative. And I think that having a voice that you can connect with is a good thing. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. So I think on that level, it's great. PMB says it's ankle-driven. Tambarella says, does it need the first stanza? And that's a thought that I had too. Doug Van Hooser says, don't hear the story. Let's read it again a little more closely. Glory in this meeting of foot and leg. And I like the title. Somebody said I like the title. And I like the title too. I've never been sure if I believe in God, but every once in a while there's a moment that I feel so fully alive, connected to all things that have ever been and ever will be. I start to believe in something. Like when I pull a scrunched but soft pant leg down to cover my ankle again, and the sensation of my own touch and the material that was woven with another's hands and this segment of skin being protected, newly cared for, and warmed feels divine. So I like the poem up to that part. I guess what for me, I start to drift here. Same for when I'm overheated and I roll a pant hem up over my ankle, giving it a shock of fresh air that feels like I'm finally appreciating my sturdy legs that have gotten me this far. So far, so good. Maybe I wouldn't have seen as many beautiful places if these too thick ankles had been slimmer. Maybe they would have been more prone to injury. But with these brief gestures, I am forgiving my body and my ankles, which, like me, also need to breathe. I will let them, and it will be glorious. I kind of, Winston Munn says the first opening stanza needs a specific image. Sir Rashid Khan says the ending was disappointing, and that's what, to me, I felt like it took a wrong turn. In the maybe. A lot of times poems just take the wrong turn. Like it's like you're driving somewhere and then you go down the wrong street and then you're like, uh-oh, and then you have to keep driving. And, eventually you sort of, give in, or you just pretend like, you're going and you get lost completely. And that's kind of what happened. The poem, when it was focused on there being some kind of divinity and that like brief pleasure of either uncovering or covering your ankle, given the heat of that and how it feels. I think that was really, really nice. It reminds me for some reason of, here, I'll put up a, what am I thinking of? Ode. Which is the one... Not ode. Oh yeah, ode to a large tuna in the market. I couldn't remember the title. It was salmon or what? Yeah. Feel how. Well, I'll read some of this poem. Maybe not the whole thing. We'll see how it goes. But this is, ode to a large tuna in the market by Pablo Neruda, and feel how like the loving way that it's described, in the detail and the specificity and the unusual way of looking at it as it's being described, is enough to carry a whole poem. So we'll read some of this. Ode to a large tuna in the market. Here among the market vegetables, this torpedo from the ocean depths, a missile that swam, now lying in front of me dead. Surrounded by the earth's green froth, these lettuces, bunches of carrots, only you lived through the sea's truth, survived the unknown, the unfathomable darkness, the depths of the sea, the great abyss, le grand abîme. Only you, varnished, black-pitched witness to that deepest night. Only you, dark bullet barreled from the depths, carrying only your one wound, but resurgent, always renewed, locked into the current, fins fletched like wings in the torrent, in the coursing of the underwater dark, like a grieving arrow, sea javelin, nervousness, oiled harpoon, dead in front of me, catafalqued king of my own ocean, once sappy as a sprung fir in the green turmoil, once seed to sea quake, tidal wave, now simply dead remains. In the whole market, yours was the only shape left with purpose or direction in this jumbled ruin of nature. You are a solitary man of war among these fragile vegetables, your flanks and prow black and slippery, as if you were still a well-oiled ship of the wind, the only true machine of the sea, unflawed, undefiled, navigating now the waters of death. And so that beautifully detailed description of the tuna at the market. As Kimberly Gibson Trent says, this is a heck of a translation. Yeah. But just the pure description of that, that image, which we've all seen before, pretty much, of a tuna or some kind of fish lying in the ice at a fish market. That depth of detail and that focus, and that there's sort of like a loving attention that's given to the poem. And notice that that's all, as PMB says, he's pretty good. But it's done in such a brilliantly descriptive way, in an imaginative way. But that's all it's actually doing. It's like praising something in the world. In this poem, glory in this meeting of foot and leg. I could really see this poem just focusing on the simple pleasures of that. It's one of those things that we sort of, again, like all experiencing that tuna, we all experience that, like my leg's hot, so I pull my pant leg up. And that feeling of like being cooled off suddenly. And there's a simple joy to that. We could focus on that throughout the entire poem and just let it stand. And I think that would work great. And I think it was leaning in that direction, just, keep working the details and making them describe it in every way possible as interestingly as possible. There's so many great lines in the Large Tuna poem by Neruda, which is what make it work. But you could do that in this poem too. But instead we take this turn into, the Two Thick Ankles, and that feels like a whole different poem, and it's not as vivid, and it's a disappointing ending. And so I think with this one, dive right into that descriptions of these two experiences, which are interesting in that like they're both so pleasurable in the opposite way. And there's so much you could go into describing it in a vivid way. And I think there's a brilliant poem that could be lurking beneath this one. Yeah. Yeah. So Rashid Khan says, but focusing on detail too much can lose the reader because sometimes there's too much details and little story or meaning. Well, how much story is there in the Neruda poem? I mean, there's none. It's just this fish and imagining, another poem that comes to mind. Well, pull this up too. We've probably mentioned this, but what's his name? Yeah. Sorry. I had one of those days where like simple names like Robert Pinsky are difficult to come up with. But, Pinsky's shirt comes to mind. The back, the yoke, the yardage, lap seams, the nearly invisible stitches along the collar, turned in a sweatshop by Koreans or Malaysians gossiping over tea and noodles on their break or talking money or politics while one fitted this arm piece with its overseen to the band of cuff I buttoned at my wrist. The presser, the cutter, the wrangle, the mangle, the needle. So it just goes in the description of the shirt. And then, of course, some history of the shirt, the fire and the factory. You can read this poem for yourself. But just focusing on the details, if you can make the details come alive like that. And I think this poem was starting to do that, which is why it'd be a fun poem to just focus on that, I think. And it's something that you don't see described very often. So I think dive into that with this poem. Yeah. Okay. Let's look at the other poem. More than a bump in the road. Spring is the season of suicidal squirrels. They dart into the streets, running toward cars. I slam on the brakes and swerve to the side. But one time I couldn't help it. The fluffy tail ran straight under my tire. That tiny 1-pound animal outmatched by 2,000 pounds of high-tensile steel and fiberglass, plus one human. My eyes squeezed, gutted by the loss of life. And yet, I wasn't flattened by the heavy machine that barreled over it. I took comfort in the jolt and bump I felt. Like the squirrel was calling out on its last breath, I was here, I lived, and in my death I won't go quietly. And you won't forget me. I still drive slower in the spring. Yeah. So it's Maria Berg and Kimberly Gibson Transay, and Richard Lorberg too. I love the opening lines, and there's some nice opening lines here. More than a bump in the road. Spring is the season of suicidal squirrels, and that is an interesting jump in the poem. We know where we are. There's a nice rhythm to this poem too, which is one of the reasons why I'd love to see the meeting of the foot and leg poem. There's a sense of rhythm and description in both these two poems that I think could work, and I think it's something to push farther as a writer. Yeah. Winston Munn points out too, notice how Neruda doesn't try to make us guess he's talking about a tuna. Exactly. Yeah. Like calling back and letting us know what we're talking about is so important. Like withholding things from the reader is something that it's really amateurish thing to do. Like there's really very few poems that we don't have a sense of where we are in time and space, what we're talking about, where it really works. Yeah. Sarah Rashid Khan says, not bad, far better than the first poem. Kimberly Gibson Trent says, I like the last line too. It doesn't wallow in regret, but the regret is there. Yeah, good point. I like the first line and the last line. How could we make this poem come to life a little more? In between, I guess maybe is the question. Spring is the season of suicidal squirrels. They dart into the street running toward cars. I slam on the brakes and swerve to the side. But one time I couldn't help it. The fluffy tail ran straight under my tire. That tiny 1-pound animal outmatched. So I think up to this point, I think it works. We have the rhythm. I think we could have some of the descriptions. They dart into the street running toward cars is fine. I slam on the brakes and swerve to the side. I mean, like slamming on the brakes is a bit cliche. I think there's a way that can be described in a little more unique way. But one time I couldn't help it. The fluffy tail ran straight under my tire. That tiny 1-pound animal outmatched by 2,000 pounds of high tensile steel and fiberglass, plus one human. Now the plus one human felt out of place to me, and I think I would cut that. My eyes squeezed, gutted by the loss of life. And again, eyes being squeezed and saying you're gutted, can you think of a better way to describe that? So that's another opportunity to make the poem more vivid and new, make it new. So in that place, I think you could say that in ways that are more unusual and surprising and thus, therefore, connect more. And it wasn't flattened by the heavy machine that barreled over it. So that's a nice description. I think that works. I took comfort in the jolt and bump I felt, like the squirrel was calling out on its last breath. So I like this part too. I like the jolt and the bump. I think what the squirrel calls out goes on too long. So like the squirrel was calling out on its last breath, I was here, I lived, and in my death I won't go quietly, and you won't forget me. I think maybe just I was here, I lived, and letting that sit by itself. So if we cut that line or 2.5 lines and just go to the ending, which I think works. Yeah. Winston Munn says, it lost something in the ending. It felt a little expected. Yeah. Sorry. Dry Montito says, I think the event could be described clinically, simply, Hemingway-ish almost, and then the thoughts about life insisting on itself and its death would pop even more. I think maybe let's look, because it's a good point too. We already looked at Neruda. Let's go to another great poet and do Philip Larkin's Mower. And feel how much emotional weight is transferred here because of the clinical way it's described. It's one of those things. And in film, you see this all the time. The more distance we have from what we're talking about, the more profound, because we are making that emotional leap. So we're connecting with it and feeling it too. So here's The Mower by Philip Larkin. You might be familiar with this poem. The mower stalled twice. Kneeling, I found a hedgehog jammed up against the blades, killed. It had been in the long grass. I hadn't seen it before, and even fed it once. Now I had mauled its unobtrusive world unmendably. Burial was no help. Next morning I got up, and it did not. The first day after a death, the new absence is always the same. We should be careful of each other. We should be kind while there's still time. And just feel how clinical and understated that is, and then you fill in the details. I think that the next morning I got up, and it did not. How much is there in that poem just because it's simply and clinically described, like Dry Montito said. And then we fill in for it. We can feel that. And so, that's why we talk about this all the time, but the adjectives and the descriptions of emotions are the weakest parts of poems, because setting up and letting us fill in that is where the power really is. And so how clinical can you make the descriptions in this poem is a good sort of thing to play with. But I like the sense of movement. I like the actual emotion. It has a sense of doing something. So good use of that. I would just, cut these lines here. Let it just say I was here, I lived, and then make it, a little more fresh in the descriptions and a little more distance, and I think that makes the poem really work well. Okay. Let's look at one more before we wrap it up. Once again, that was Lauren Ortel from Texas. Yeah. Let's take a look at the next poet. Again, we're looking at early March. Wade's Samples from Tennessee has let's see, 2 poems, one short, one long. We'll take a look at the shorter poem first. And long is like not really that long, so don't worry. Warehouse. It's easy to forget why we work, why we shout over ourselves for the ideal way to move things and to move them back. We shout just to be right, just so someone hears us over the sound of clanging metal and purring forklift and its toxic fumes, which we say lead to strokes. There is no nook, never a cranny, where silence can be witnessed, or where it can witness you. So that's interesting. I really like the simplicity. Speaking of like simple clinical descriptions, I think that's the strength of this poem, where it's working, and having something be profound and yet simple about it. And yeah. So I should say I haven't. Yeah, it's been an hour. If you haven't clicked the like button yet, please do. Then more people watch it later because the like to viewers ratio is good. We have like 3 times as many almost people watching now as have clicked like so far, and that helps. So yeah, Nancy Sabanek says good metaphor. Let's see, warehouse. It's easy to forget why we work, why we shout over ourselves for the ideal way to move things and to move them back. There's just a really simple beauty to that. I really love that. We shout just to be right, just so someone hears us over the sound of the clanging metal and purring forklift. And this is the one line that fell off to me. And it's toxic fumes, which we say lead to strokes. Feel how abstract and like conceptual those 2 lines are. I mean, not the toxic fumes, although even toxic is sort of a abstraction. But then the supposition that they might lead to strokes takes us so far out of that like simple description of the poem. Yeah. And so I think just getting rid of that, like that's the kind of thing to avoid. Let the images be there and stand for what they stand for. And I think that works really well. There is no nook, never a cranny where silence can be witnessed or where it can witness you. And then the only thing is that enough of an ending? Does it feel, it feels to me like maybe there's another line that it didn't quite say that it wants to say. Has it gotten far enough? Yeah, I'm not sure. So I think, cutting the strokes thing, which is just, it's off for the voice and what the poem is doing. Yeah. Kimberly Gibson Trent says purring could be something less positive tone too. Sarah Rashid Khan, it's not a poem I would remember at all. And that's the thing that's sort of missing at the end. It's like a great setup. We're like situated in this place. I think Kimberly Gibson Tran maybe said, I like the world of the warehouse. And so, but it's like, what did we take away from it? What do we learn from it? And I think that is why I feel like there's a little more to say. There's like 2 more lines that are missing. Yeah. And I just feel like it just wants a little bit more digging into what it means to be the warehouse, but not obviously directly saying it. I don't know. It's one of those tough ones. It'd be easy to be like, we work because blah, blah, blah. And that's not quite what I mean. Let's see, let me read it one more time, and I'll skip those 2 lines that don't work, and we'll see if there's anybody has any thoughts about where you can go at the end. It feels like it just needs that thing to make Sarah Rashid Khan remember it. That's like the thing that's missing. Warehouse. It's easy to forget why we work, why we shout over ourselves for the ideal way to move things and to move them back. We shout just to be right, just so someone hears us over the sound of clanging metal and purring forklift and its toxic fumes, which we say lead to strokes. Oops, I better skip that. There is no nook, never a cranny where silence can be witnessed or where it can witness you. There is never a blah, 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 blah. Like there's something there. Oh, what is the last thing? Just, I don't know, then one of the things maybe, I can even feel, there is no nook, never a cranny. There is no, what's that? Like sleep on it, like have your imagination come up with the last line. And I think the poem will be good. And cut those 2 about the strokes. And I think that's a good poem. Let's take a look at the longer one now. Thrift. Rows of sharp metal shelves filled with goods of forgotten desire and buyer's remorse. That's a good description. A brown fuzzy bear, engraved red heart, the cracked white plastic of a used ice cream machine, or an orange stained pair of size 6 cleats. I stare at a faux wood sign that reads, "Live, laugh, love," filled with anger at its simplicity. I laugh at the sad sap who would use those discounted words as if it were so simple. Shadows give way to scenes staged in kitchens and hallways with the screams of stars running through aluminum vents. Supporting actors quivering in fear or pretending to be unshaken by the echoes of these shelves. A red and beige mobile tube, cracked green hose slithers through a small and patchy lawn. Small bare feet of giant thoughts leap over a zigzag dark depression the size of the Grand Canyon. Rotting wood, steps, and a screen door. The eyes of a smoke-filled man watch his distant son playing in Arizona. Simple words hang over the door, smothered with dust and knowledge that they're enough. Well, yeah, PNB says nice music. And yeah, so where's the poem working? Yeah. And I think the poem is working to me where we list the details of what's there at the thrift store. Yes, Nancy Sabanik says, I like thrift, but it is one-sided in its negative descriptions. Yeah, PMB says just describing random things in a thrift shop. And Mary Lisa says, I kind of lose it when the hose appears. Yeah, Kimberly Gibson Tran, good energy in stanza 1 details. Sad sap veers into Holden Caulfield territory, says Richard Laurenberg. Okay. Yeah. And Kimberly Gibson Tran says the criticism of the sign is a little meh. Yeah. So it's one of these poems. This one's drifting around to me in the store, seeing things, describing them well with a nice sense of music, as PMB pointed out. We're riding along, waiting for the poet to put it together into a kind of meaning and finding some purpose in it. And sort of, as there was a wrong direction with the thickness of the ankles in that other poem. It feels like it loses its way a little bit too. Let me read it one more time. Thrift. Rows of sharp metal shells filled with goods of forgotten desire and buyer's remorse. That's a good description. A brown fuzzy bear, engraved red heart, the crack white plastic of a used ice cream machine, or an orange stained pair of size 6 cleats. So good descriptions. We're ready to hear why we're being shown these. I stare at a faux wood sign that reads live, laugh, love, filled with anger at its simplicity. So we have anger here. And the question is why is the speaker witnessing this triggered so much? And anger by this sign? I laugh at the sad sap who would use those discounted words as if it were so simple. And that tries to explain it, but then we sort of move away from that. And we go back into shadow. And I don't think that sort of returns. So it's not enough where like it's exploring like my feelings about this and why I'm sort of so cynical. It's not like going in that direction because this doesn't come back. So it's like a potential direction that way. And then we turn off that road and return to the scene and things that are waiting there. Shadows give way to scenes staged in kitchens and hallways of stars running through aluminum vents. So this stanza, I have real trouble seeing and understanding how we have stars and supporting actors and in the vents. I'm a little confused. Like what shadows? I don't understand. So this stanza leaves me confused. But then we go back. A red and beige mobile tube, cracked green hose slithers, mobile tube, cracked green hose slithers through a small and patchy lawn. Small bare feet of giant thoughts leap over a zigzag dark depression. And so if we're looking at a hose and then thinking back to the places the hose has lived and the things it like would have seen, I guess that can be interesting. The zagging dark depression the size of the Grand Canyon is a little too melodramatic and a bit cliche. But then we move again, and we don't really find ourselves. Rotting wood steps and a screen door. The eyes of a smoke-filled man watch his distant son playing in Arizona. And now I'm really lost at this point. Where are the rotting wood steps? Are we still on the hose? And why do we focus so much on what the hose brings up as imagination? Um, simple words hang over the door, smothered with dust and knowledge that they're enough. So we're back to these live, laugh, love? Is that the faux wood sign? Is that the faux wood sign that's hanging over the door here? I'm just a little lost about where we went once we got off the track of the poem here. So it's a good setup, but I'm a little too confused. And if we wanted to focus on, building out a scene and a whole family story from the hose in the yard, then I think maybe we need to like frame that more so we're not lost with it. So there's that. PB says it's a vintage lunchbox. Petty Arbor says, giving up cynicism, he is the sap returning to the simplicity of sign. So he's the sap? I don't know. It just loses me. I think it's just not clear, even though we, so what works is the description of that and then spring off into, I think, the imagination. And then how do you tie that into a thing that has a message that we can take something from? Jane Milton says, is the poem really about what makes the narrator angry? I don't know what the poem's really about. That's the problem. I don't know where the father is. Kimberly Gibson Trent says that we may have the clarity of stanza 1 throughout. And yeah, exactly. Yeah. Mark Grenier says, stick the last 3 lines after simplicity and cut the stuff between. Where's simplicity? Simplicity. Let's read it that way. We'll read it Mark Grenier's way. Mark likes short poems, I know. Here's thrift. Thrift. Rows of sharp metal shells filled with goods of forgotten desire and buyer's remorse. A brown fuzzy bear, engraved red heart, the cracked white plastic of a used ice cream machine, or an angry, orange-stained pair of size 6 cleats. I stare at a faux wood sign that reads, live, laugh, love, filled with anger at its simplicity. Simple words hang over the door, smothered with dust and knowledge that they're enough. I'm not sure that works either. So what's working is finding those, describing those images, going through the stuff, and then imagining where that goes. And then you got to pull that together into some kind of message or some kind of thing that we can take away from it so that we find that our time was well spent entering this poem. All right, well, that's going to wrap it up. Thanks, everybody, for sharing. Once again, that last poet was Wade Samples. Some interesting stuff there from Tennessee. Thanks, Wade, for sharing that. And that is going to wrap up the critique of the week for this week. Once again, let's see. So let me put on the little music here. And let me remind everybody that... let's see. Oh, the Poetry Space just came out with that's Katie Dozer's show. Wonderful episode with Billy Collins. Check that out. Talking about accessibility and poetry and the importance of a lot of the stuff. There's so much relevance to what Billy says for what we talk about on here regularly. He puts it different ways and illuminates some of that too, while sharing some of his great poems. So listen to that anywhere you find your podcast. Now coming up on the Rattlecast, which I have to remind everybody is Monday now. We're shifting to Monday nights. It just works a lot better for us having a weekend where we can do things. So Monday night, the guest is going to be Richard Sykin. Now, Richard Sykin is a brilliant poet. He was selected by Louise Gluck, his book Crush, for the Yale Younger Poets Prize. That really, I think, the best first book award. Really, I remember it was the book that was the sort of the talk of the town when I started in this job as a poetry editor 21 years ago. And he had a follow-up book about 10 years after that, and this is his third. I Do Know Some Things. He's got a poem. They're all prose poems. He's got a prose poem in the current issue of Rattle. Should be really fascinating talking to him. That's Richard Sykin, Rattlecast number 307. The prompt for this week was to write a poem that touches on hair. Did I get that right? Write a poem that touches on hair. Yes, that's your prompt for this week. You can submit that after Katie gets through all the August poems. This is a September 1st episode, a September 1st submission. So that means it's going to be prompt poem of the month in September if it is. So you have to wait a little bit to submit, but you can share your poems on September 1st. That's how we do it. So write your poems that touch on hair. We'll talk to Richard Sykin. That's Monday, September 1st, 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific. Hope to see you there. Hope you have a great weekend. In the meantime, we'll talk to you later. And happy Labor Day, too. Goodbye.